Welcome everybody. For those online, those in person, thank you so much for joining us. This is actually November, and this is our first SOCAAR Seminar of the year, so very happy to have everyone here and everyone online. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker,
Distinguished.
Meredith Franklin,
Thank you.
who has got to be making her way across the country. If I can following your record, you did your undergraduate at McGill.
Yep.
You went to Carleton for your master's.
Yep.
And then you did 15 years at USC, University of Southern California.
I was there. Well, I went to PhD at Harvard.
Harvard,
yeah. So then I moved to the States about 20 years ago and then stayed. Yeah.
So Harvard, USC.
Harvard, U Chicago for my postdoc, and then USC. So I really did make my way across.
You went across, you loop back.
Yeah.
And now we're fortunate to have her back in Toronto.
Yep.
Where you've been for a year.
A year now. Yeah. Yeah. Never lived in Toronto before, but so.
Yeah.
But it's good to be. Place. It is. I'm really liking it so far.
Yeah. The last weekend, 10 years to see.
Yeah, winter. That was hard to get back into, but. Yeah, exactly.
So today, this talk is on one of our favorite topics, non-tailpipe emissions. I gather this is part of a project that you did multi-years in Southern California from Health Effects Institute.
Yeah, so the picture in behind shows where this was done. That's Los Angeles. Yeah. So, but this, the study was done, and it's still continued. The grant is still at USC, actually.
Wonderful.
So, yeah.
Well, join me in welcoming Meredith Franklin.
Thanks. All right, so thank you for the nice introduction and for the invitation to come here. So yes, as you can see from the picture behind, this is where I lived for 12 years before moving here. I was in the biostats division at the University of Southern California, but the University of Southern California has a very large foothold on looking at the association between air pollution, which was very bad in Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s, and children's health. They've really focused on children's health. So this study, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is related to my work there. So, but in terms of background, our focus here is on non-tailpipe particles. So as a background, for exhaust emissions, well studied, regulated, and we can see that from the graph on the right here that the trends in PM related to exhaust emissions have decreased thanks to those regulations. Whereas on the other hand, the non-exhaust emissions have been understudied and not regulated, other than being regulated up through the particulate mass as a whole. Basically, this plot is from the MOVES, the EPA. So this is US data. I guess everything today is US data. So, but this is just showing average brake and tire wear PM emission rates. And basically what this plot is showing is that the vehicles here, it's hard to see this up here, but this is intercity buses, garbage trucks. These types of vehicles are braking a lot more. So it's just showing that the contribution is much greater for these types of vehicles that have frequent braking activities. They emit more brake wear and tire wear particles. So non-tailpipe emissions. So I'm going to focus on sort of defining what those are and how we've been defining them in terms of tracers. So non-exhaust emissions, particulate matter, in both size fractions, PM2.5 and PM10. Well, all size fractions. We'll see where we're going to also talk about quasi-ultrafine. Brake wear basically really focuses on copper. Some of this is the tracers are, they've kind of been defined for health effects assessments. But it also, brake wear comes with a lot of other things, such as iron, zinc, zirconium, tin, and which is potentially carcinogenic. Tire wear, zinc is the main tracer for indicating tire wear, but of course a big area is microplastics for tire wear, and resuspended road dust. Our tracer that we look at and that other studies have examined is iron, but that's also comes from a lot of other sources too. So resuspended road dust might also contribute to aluminum concentration, silica, and calcium. But it's sometimes hard to really distinguish some of these things from just regular windblown dust. So resuspended road dust, all of these things are hard to distinguish specifically with one tracer, but we do tend to look at those when we look at the health effects of them. So basically, the trajectory of my talk today will be going from basically emissions, which we've talked about now, to the measurements. Of course, we've made extensive measurements. And then in our case, we've done, and this is more my bread and butter, is the exposure modeling. And so I'll focus on the models that we built for that. And the models were developed in order to develop exposures for a health effects study. So that leads me to our general study design. The Southern California, it was actually the Children's Health Study is what the name of it, but our Southern California study, this is the overview of the study area. So basically, the dots are showing the study participants, which in the next slide, I'll show you how many study participants we have. But basically, health and environmental data were collected they're colored by these 8 different Southern California communities. At the time of the data collection for the environmental samples, the PM samples, this area was home to 4 of the 10 most populated counties because it covered Los Angeles County, San Diego County, Orange County, and Riverside County. And it was the most densely populated urbanized area in the US. I think it's been surpassed by New York, but I'm not sure when the latest census, the 2020 census, whether that has changed back to the LA area. And then in the inset here is Santa Barbara. So these are our 8 communities, which are kind of clustered. So it was an unusual study design, but a lot of statistical work went into the modeling for this to be able to make sure that we were capturing the spatial and temporal trends properly within these sort of clustered communities. So the study cohort, all of this was motivated by health, this whole study. The Children's Health Study is one of the longest and most detailed studies of the effect of air pollution on children's health. It actually had multiple longitudinal cohorts that started in the early 90s. And the study that I'll be talking about today focuses on the last cohort, which enrolled kids at age 5 to 7 in 2003, and they were followed until 2012. And in fact, some follow-on studies followed them into young adulthood as well. But they focused on a few different things. So it's been a very well studied, and this is cohort E, A, B, C, D, E. So it's the 5th cohort from this Children's Health Study. So it was a very large study. In the 8 communities, just in cohort E, there were over 6,000 children. So it's a very, very large study population. A huge effort, and it was funded by multiple sources, primarily the National Institutes of Health. So the way that the study was conducted is that there were children questionnaires that were administered at baseline, and that collected extensive data on family, the child, of course, and family characteristics, household characteristics. And so that was done at the study onset, so we have a very large database of baseline characteristics. And then after that, annual questionnaires were administered. So they did all of this at the schools. So they focused on recruiting students at the schools, and then when they administered the questionnaires, they brought them to the schools, and the kids would bring them home and do them. But then they also conducted health analyses. So they did collect data through the questionnaire mostly on asthma, different types of asthma, doctor-diagnosed asthma incidence, that type of thing. And then lung function, where they went into the schools and in 3 different years and did a subset of kids in 2008, 2010, and 2012, a subset of almost 2,000 kids where they did spirometry. And then they also collected data in certain questionnaire years. They collected different types of data, so information on sleep, information on stress. We did a study of stress and sleep. I'll show some of those results. And so those were in the annual questionnaires. They collected some other data that could be used, usually cross-sectionally, but the lung function data was longitudinal, and so that enabled us to do some longitudinal studies. So some important studies have come out of this cohort, one of which was, I think, published in 2016 or so, where they had another HEI study, which was an accountability study, and they found that since they have collected data for so long, since the 90s when air quality in the LA area was so bad, they did find that there were improvements in children's lung function and asthma over time, given the decreases in primarily tailpipe emissions. So the focus of the study has mostly been on tailpipe emissions. And then here I have, they also did some work. This is important for our particular HEI study where we're looking at genetic ancestry. So they had 3,000 of the 6,000 kids, over 3,000 of 6,000 kids had genetic ancestry done through DNA that were used as ancestral informative markers. And then of the lung function, we have 1,300 of the 1,900. Okay, so that's the background of the cohort, and then we'll get back to some health effects a little bit later. But the most important or interesting part for this group, I'm sure, is the PM sampling and the exposure modeling. So here's the map again. This is actually showing those 8 communities, but a subset of them, of the dots. So this was done in 2008, late 2008, mostly 2009, the intra-community variability study, the ICV study, where in each of the CHS communities that were studied, approximately 26 to 29 sampling locations were established. And they were established in the schools, in homes, other locations, centralized locations within the community. And you can see here, this is Anaheim. So I've zoomed into Anaheim, that it was selected to support the CHS, but it was also designed to capture the full range of high and low ambient pollution gradients across the region. So we selected sampling locations. I was not involved in this part. I was still in, where was I at this time? Chicago or Boston. So I wasn't part of the actual sampling. I've just looked at the data. But they selected locations that were defined by high, 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 low, low, high, and low, low concentrated gradients, basically from roads. Anaheim was one. I just wanted to zoom into Anaheim because it shows even within Anaheim it's a little bit clustered, but we did go, away from freeways by certain distances, and then tried to focus on some major arterials, and then some residential, of course, residential locations, because if they were sampling from the kids' homes, they were in more residential locations. So that's sort of the design of the locations. Now, the sampling design was also a little bit complicated. There were 2 modified Harvard Cascade impactors that had cutoffs at 0.2, 0.5, 2.5, and 10 micrometers. And that allowed us to combine the 0.2, the 0.5 and the 2.5, but we captured quasi-ultrafine, so that's what we were able to capture 0.2 accumulation mode, which I will use the word fine for that, but it was accumulation mode that we've modeled and looked at. Coarse, and then the sampling schedule was such that we had, this is the complicated thing, where we had, because of the number of samples, we had to deploy the instruments at the same time within a community. And so typically 2 communities were sampled at the same time, and then they moved the next month to other communities. And then they did this, so they left the samplers out for a month, basically, and they collected 2 consecutive 2-week composite PM samples in 2 seasons. And then at one central site, and I think actually I looked back at the data earlier today, and at a couple of the schools, they actually did. So they captured it in the warm season. So this is Southern California, warm and cool is what they call it, but it barely the weather barely changes. So warm was like April to October, and cool was the remaining. But then at these central site locations, they captured some of the quote unquote shoulder season, spring and fall. And so, but that basically just gave us a little bit more data, and it helped us generate the exposure models on a monthly basis, which I'll talk about in a bit. So that was the sampling schedule, and then and what we captured. Then the filters were collected. Oh, and I didn't go over this. So foam puffs were used, except for at the 0.2 stage, the Teflon filters were used. So then the puffs were sent for ICP-MS, And it was conducted to determine the concentrations of 48 elements that both in the total and the water soluble. And so this is also very unique in that water soluble PM was examined. And so that was captured in each size fraction. Elemental carbon and organic carbon were from the quasi-ultrafine and fine fraction, were determined from quartz filters using thermal optical transmissions. And the quartz filters were also used to determine water-soluble organic carbon, and then insoluble organic carbon was calculated as the difference between the total and the water-soluble fraction. And we used the Wisconsin State Laboratory of Hygiene. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that group, but they conducted the ICP-MS analysis and the thermal optical transmissions for us. Okay, so this was actually done a while ago, right? This was done in 2009, basically. What happened was there were so many filters collected. So due to funding constraints in 2010, soon after the sampling, they were only able to do analysis at the Wisconsin State Lab for half of the puffs. And they did all of the ultrafines because they thought that they would see some interesting results from that. But then for coarse and fine, they did not analyze all of the samples. So some of the early work that was done with these data were basically just half the data set. They randomized it so the waves were not only, it wasn't like only one season that was done and not the other season. They had a mix of the seasons. But then when we submitted for funding in 2018, we got funding from the HEI, and which was very interesting to go through freezers, which I did myself, to find all of these puffs for basically 200 puffs. And we had sent them back to Wisconsin. We did the same methods were applied. The same folks were still working there 10 years later, and they did the same analyses. We did a bunch of checks, with blanks and other things to make sure that we had a few that were reserved in this case exactly, so we could check to ensure the data quality and that they could all be combined, and so everything was fine. So we have now this very large data set. So there are over 220 locations, so over 450 samples, which is one of the largest speciated data sets assembled in the US, and I'm assuming in Canada too. And actually, I was going to just show this map. It might be hard to, I'll just show it let's see if I can, because I didn't, let's see if I showed, yeah, I didn't show the results here. I wanted to show the map because there's so much data. Let me see if I can open it up here. Let me see. Oh. Okay, it's not working. I can show that after, for those who might be interested. I haven't shown very much of just the raw results of the and the chemical analysis and the data, what it looks like. So we created this shiny app through R, so we could have maps and we could really detailed look into the concentrations and generate box plots for all of them. And basically, there were so many elements that we were concerned with, that were, 48 elements were measured. So we had to go through all this in great detail. But then, of course, I'm hoping that this is still shared properly. Let me just double check. Okay, yeah, I guess it's still okay. There we go. Okay, sorry, I was just putting up the bar at the bottom. So we did this analysis of all these elements, but of course for the HEI grant and for this talk, we're most interested on focusing on the fine and coarse copper, zinc, and iron to represent brake wear, tire wear, and resuspended road dust. I missed that here. We also were very interested in copper. There were some regulations put in place in California in terms of copper, which did not come into play until later, much later than the sampling. But we wanted to look at water-soluble copper, and we have some other water-soluble results as well. But that was, as for importance as being more biologically available, we focused on that for our exposure modeling. And then for sort of comparison, we also examined ship emissions, which are a big thing because Long Beach is one of our cities. And also the regulations at the time of sampling, there's been additional regulations that for ship idling since then, but at the time there were not. So vanadium ship idling, meaning that now ships at Long Beach have to plug in to an electrical source. They're not allowed to just idle in the port. But at the time they were still allowed to idle. And then we looked at fine EC for diesel, coarse calcium, and for, you know, kind of a mix of crustal and maybe traffic suspended dust, and of course sodium for sea salt. So those were our markers. Now, one thing that did come up just before talking is that what did you do source apportionment? Well, we did some source apportionment, but we did not find, so there was actually a study that was published out of our group with the earlier data set with missing half of the samples, in which they had found, you know, were able to resolve traffic sources, but it was very difficult to disentangle the non-tailpipe traffic source from the tailpipe traffic source. So we didn't actually really move forward with that. We do have results from the data on that, and I can share the link to the paper that was done with the source apportionment, but we did apply PMF on the sources. And I did look at some of those sources again with the full data set, but we really were having a hard time resolving much in terms of the non-tailpipe, and given the focus of the grant, we then just went forward with focusing on these particular tracers. Okay, so now I'll talk about my favorite part, exposure modeling. Okay, so we did a huge feature extraction, meaning we were focused, the main gist of the grant was to really understand if intersections because of braking with the non-tailpipe were important. So we did an extensive analysis of gathering data about roadways. So we used OpenStreetMap for that, for all the road features. So OpenStreetMap is an open source map. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, but you can query it in many different ways to get a lot of information. So you can get different road classifications, which you can get from other sources too, but you can get road lengths, but you can get intersections. And how did we do? And we also on and off ramps. So that was another thing that we focused on. We didn't have it listed here, but we did put those in our model. But the intersections, we looked at every intersection in each of our communities where like roads crossed. So we just considered minor intersections, and then we classified them as minor, minor, major, minor, depending on the road classification of the intersection. And so we were really kind of interested in minor intersections, because that's where there'd be stop signs, because we were hoping to find the locations of stop signs, and we were thinking of doing some like image analysis of Google Street View to get stop signs, and it was just, you know, very difficult. So we basically used intersections based on the intersections of roads from OpenStreetMap. The other interesting thing that we did, even though these samples were collected sort of over a longer period of time in which we could get sort of these monthly average concentrations, we were interested in meteorology, because a lot of the other exposure modeling efforts, such as the ESCAPE studies, had not incorporated meteorology. So what we did for meteorology was we, I don't know if you guys have heard of the Dark Sky app. Apple bought it a couple years ago, but the Dark Sky app has an API, meaning that you can query their data, but they have hyper-local data. They use all of the weather stations, and then they generate, you can generate estimates based on distance to the weather stations for any point, and then you can also get it at very high temporal resolution. So we extracted those for each of our sampling locations. So all of these data were extracted for the ICV sampling locations in order to build the model. And then we also got a whole bunch of other data. We looked at green space from EBI, elevation. We calculated stability. We used, I can't remember the mono-ubicon length or something. I'm sure those in the audience know that a little bit more better than I do, but we calculated stability. We had to deal with the ocean. We looked at ship routes and distance to shoreline. We also had estimates of near roadway emissions, so that actually was important for us. We looked at CalLine, which is a line source dispersion model. I think it was specifically built for California, but I'm sure that it's, you know, usable in other places. But there's other options for that type of modeling too. So we had those estimates for freeway and non-freeway. That was the focus of a lot of the prior work for this cohort. So to look at the freeway and non-freeway NOx. Population density, another important one was building footprints. So we used Microsoft Maps to extract those data. We extracted all of these data for different buffers. We had, in the end, 184. Oh, I didn't talk about traffic. So we actually, it's very hard to get traffic data too, but obviously that's very important. Caltrans, the California Transportation Department of Transportation, has a lot, quite a bit of traffic measurements, given that it's, Southern California where there's so many people and so much traffic. But it was mostly focused on freeways. So what we did is we used those data, but we then used this simulation model called SUMO, which is open source, a European model. And through that, we were able to generate traffic volumes, densities, and speeds. And the AADTs were acquired from the state. And we were able to see the different annual average daily traffic counts for trucks and vehicles. And some of that data went into SUMO as well. We also did this at a buffer extraction. So yeah, so we had this huge database of predictor variables associated with each of our measurements. So we had 184 variables. I have down here, we tested a variety of different modeling strategies. But given that we had a relatively large set of features, but a small number of samples, we ended up finding that spatiotemporal linear regression was best. Spatiotemporal linear regression meaning that we had temporally varying variables from the meteorology, and the green space was temporally varying as well. But then we had and then spatially varying variables, of course, from all of the GIS variables that we had. And then we also looked at semi-variograms, so meaning we did an actual spatial analysis afterwards to see if we had captured the spatial variance. So this is sort of my area of expertise, is to look at the spatial distribution of this from the models. And so we ended up doing this. We checked the residual spatial autocorrelation, and we didn't have very much left. So in the end, it was basically just a big spatiotemporal linear regression, or a land use type regression, but with temporally varying variables. So and then we tested the variable importance, which I'll show in a minute. And then what we did was so the reason for all of this, of course, was that we had those sampling locations. Only a small subset of the locations were actual kids' homes. So we needed to get the, for all 6,000 kids that were in the cohort, we needed to estimate, in order to do any health effects assessments, we needed to predict all of the elements at the kids' homes and schools. And so what we did is we were able to do this because of the samples staggered sampling we had. We were able to generate monthly estimates covering the sampling period from mostly 2009, late 2008 through 2009. And then this was just our variable selection procedure. Of course, we started with 184 variables, which was a lot. And then we would take 10 at a time, basically conduct backward selection, and then keep going back and forth to see, and then just checking the R squares of the models. So it was just basically like we tested different, even using machine learning methods for variable selection, but this one worked well. I think, again, because of the small n that we had and the large number of variables. And then so that was that, and then we of course did cross validation, and this was done for in two different ways. So we did a cross validation that was more conservative in terms of more conservative because the results are not as good. You don't get as high R squares when you leave one community out. But we also really wanted to test how we were doing because of the cluster design of our communities in our study region. So we basically were able to get a good test of the spatial predictability of the models from the leave one community out. And then we did a standard 10-fold, and the standard 10-fold just randomly selects, 10% of the data for the test set, spatially random. So, so those are the two types that we did. Now this slide is very busy, but I wanted to point out a few things. So this is from our paper, but we selected, this one's focusing on the non-tailpipe and then a few other ones, but we developed models for all 48 elements, and then we have them in the supplement, and we have all the water soluble different size fractions. It was this was a very large effort, but we had very good results we found our best overall model was actually for coarse copper. We saw a good so these are actually the statistics here are just the mean concentrations for each of the communities. So we see quite a good variability between communities. We can focus on copper. Highest in Long Beach, lowest in Santa Barbara. Not too surprising. But our best model was for coarse copper, but we had very high R squares for all of them. Ranging from about the lowest was about 0.6 up to 0.82. And that we're basing on the leave one community out cross validation, which is a little bit more conservative, because as you can see, the R square for the tenfold cross validation for our best model was 0.92. And then we compared to a few other studies, we were finding that this method was, very good. So we attribute it to being able to really capture a lot of, because of all the variables that we selected from. We did such a extensive characterization of the roadways and the intersections and all of that stuff that we were able to do a better job. And meteorology seemed to really play an important role, because all of these other studies, so I'll just summarize, our model for copper, we're comparing the tenfold because that's what the other studies had shown. Previous models were mostly from Ehrman was ours when we only had half the data set. And then these other ones were from the ESCAPE studies. And if you're not familiar with the ESCAPE studies, it's basically a European-wide, very similar study, but done in Europe. But instead of like communities within a region, they did sampled. It had a similar sampling campaign in various cities across Europe. So the spatial scale was much faster. And then EC 2.5, we had really good performance. And this is usually a very tough one to model. So we had a lot better performance from our approach than some of the other previous efforts. Our other effort, we only had a 0.5, but we were able to get a 0.91 for the tenfold cross validation, which was very good. Okay, in terms of variable importance, so this is the way that we rank them is I've grouped them here in colors for the type. So, this is showing down here. So the meteorological variables, which were all the most important actually, were in pink. And then the road features were in green, and the traffic related variables, which include like the freeway knock, the CAL line data, and the AADTs and traffic volumes. And then other variables were basically the building heights and population density. So we can see universally that meteorology played a very important role in these models. And, that probably helped us a lot because we did have temporally varying data even though they were month-long samples, with this weird sampling strategy that we had, that it really helped capture the variability in the data, in the concentrations because of meteorology. And then we did see this interesting trend where small intersections were playing an important role. It's hard to really distinguish it here, but minor intersections played an important role for coarse, both total and water soluble copper, and coarse iron and zinc. So, of course, our hypothesis was that the breaking was going to increase these concentrations, and we were able to, capture that with these variables that included intersections. So, and then we found that major intersections were important for EC 2.5. And then traffic volumes and dispersion model estimates were important for the non-tailpipe models compared to these other ones that didn't show up. Well, the AADT just showed up for calcium, but the others didn't. For the other ones, didn't show up at all. Okay, so then we made predictions for all the study participants. I'll zoom back into Anaheim, which we see, I don't have a scale here, it's on this one, that we see, good gradients around major roads near the freeways, much higher, and, much lower in the residential areas. So these are the study participants in Anaheim. So all of these are actually the original map that I showed with all the study participants. Another important thing was the prediction correlation. So the range of the correlations was between minus 0.28 and 0.8, basically suggesting the reason why this is important is for the EPI studies. When we have a lower correlation between them, we were hoping that we could then independently evaluate most of the health effects from the tailpipe and non-tailpipe from this, but because the correlations for the non-tailpipe elements were moderate from 0.5 to 0.7, which is not as high as it was from some of the other studies that have been conducted that are similar to this, it may be a little bit more difficult to distinguish the health effects from them. But we also found modest correlations of the water-soluble and total copper, which we were hoping would help us evaluate whether the soluble fraction was more bioavailable than and had larger health effects. That was one of our hypotheses. Okay, now I'll get through the epi side. So some prior studies, so this is just to link the exposure assessment with health effect studies. So the methods for exposure assessment that have been done before, there's very few that have been able to do it this way. Most use nearest monitor. I did some of my early work when we looked at just looking at the EPA monitors and the concentrations from that. Some people did PCA. George Thurston was working with the PCA for sources, but from the nearest monitor. People have used chemical transport model, Mike Kleeman's models that have, he develops different chemical PM profiles. Land use regression, ESCAPE and us, but we did land use regression and machine learning. And so this is, this is our work. And we have some health effects studies from that, some of the work that we've done that I'll show in a second. So the motivation behind this is that there has been some evidence of, but still not super clear on the health effects associated with non-tailpipe. So I'm going to focus on long-term exposures and health because that's the focus of our health effects studies on long-term exposures. We obviously cannot really look at acute studies, outcomes given the sampling design of the ICB study. But some of the long-term exposures have found long-term PM associated with mortality. Of course, that's been studied extensively. But in this particular study, which is out of Harvard, they found increased risk with relative to concentrations of copper and iron in the mass. So if the mass was higher in copper and iron, then they saw higher incidence of mortality. This was another one with Bart and Mike Kleeman's model, and he used the 4.4 kilometer resolution estimates from his model. They found significant associations with ischemic heart disease mortality, and they did find some associations with copper and ultrafine copper and iron. And then mentioned many times the ESCAPE study, so that's an extensive study, and they've looked at mortality as well and a few other outcomes, but this is just to show that long-term non-tailpipe PM on cardiovascular mortality, respiratory mortality, and lung cancer were examined. And in this case, they used a similar model to us, a land use regression exposure estimate in these, I think they had, I can't remember how many cities were included here, but they did find that markers of brake wear copper and tire wear zinc were significantly associated with cardiovascular and respiratory mortality. Okay, so for the children's health study, we looked at non-respiratory outcomes. We looked at psychosocial stress, but we didn't have the non-tailpipe exposures ready at the time. But we did find some interesting stuff related to sleep. We didn't find anything with the non-tailpipe, but we did look at a multi-pollutant assessment of sleep. And for sleep, the non-tailpipe really didn't play a role, but nor did tailpipe. So in sleep, we really found there was not so much of an effect of air pollution, but there was a large protective effect of green space, which was really protective for low SES participants. And then, of course, stress mediated this association. So because we had seen evidence of that before. In our stress work, we did find associations with tailpipe NOx. But the main thing that we were interested in is lung function. So this was one of the primary aims, as I mentioned before, of the CHS, and it was basically to examine the associations of near roadway pollution and children's respiratory health. But so this is the sort of first attempt at, for this children's health study to look at non-tailpipe or other. So we, with the complete ICV sample, we can really look at the role of PM and specifically the different sizes of the chemical species. And this is just a schematic showing stuff that we all know that, where the particles will deposit in the lung, given on the size fraction. So what do we do for lung function? This is a long list of our methods. I'll just explain. We had to take a multi-level approach. We had this funny design, with the different communities. And then because we had longitudinal lung function, we basically did two-stage regression where, so a mixed effects analysis and in two stages, where in the first stage you regressed against the time varying factors on the FEV and FVC. So FEV is forced expiratory volume and FVC is forced vital capacity. For those of you that don't know, those are the markers of lung function that you blow into the spirometer and then get a measure of basically the volume of your lung. And so we did that in the first stage, and then in the second stage we regressed on static features on the residuals from the first stage. And this is where we included the non-tailpipe components. So what did we do? We did attempt to look at modeling the non-tailpipe at different time periods, but the only thing that we had in our models that was time varying was the meteorology. But we were finding that the trends were kind of all over the place in the 3 years that we had, so we felt a little bit less confident in making predictions not only in space but also in time. So the design that we took for this study, for this analysis, was that we fixed the exposure for the non-tailpipe on at basically the year on 2009, which was the ICD measurement year, which was the year prior to the lung function measurements. And so oftentimes what we do is we do the exposure from the year before and then the lung function measurement. And because we had monthly estimates, we were able to do it specific for the time of the year before when a child had their lung function measurement at the school. And then we adjusted for age, sex, BMI, height, race, ethnicity, exposure to smoke, and parental education, which we use as a marker of SES. Because we have it for each child, it's a little bit better than using like census. We found it to be a little bit better than using census data. And then we also looked at the role of genetic admixture, where because of a prior study in the cohort, they found the proportion of Native American ancestry really did differentiate the effects of, in their case, asthma and lung function related to tailpipe. So we added that as well. So continuous or binary, and where binary we did it whether it's greater or less than 50% Native American. So the reason Native American in Southern California is basically Hispanic origin, whether it's Native from Hispanic or European descent from, because it's our population. I don't show the statistics here, but I think it's probably 75% Latino, but there's a variety of Native American in that. So this is also a busy slide, but I put here a summary. So this is my last slide of results. So this is our results for FEV. So we found statistically significant associations with coarse copper, iron, and calcium, and fine iron. FVC we found significant for coarse and fine iron and copper, as well as coarse zinc. We see that the largest, it's hard to pinpoint from all of these numbers, but the largest per IQR increase, so these are scaled by the IQR of the exposure, the largest per IQR increase in lung function was associated with fine iron. Water soluble was not showing an increased effect per IQR. Our models were not quite as good for that, so maybe there's just a little bit more exposure misclassification, but we were a little surprised to see that. There were a fewer samples as well that were analyzed for water soluble. I didn't mention that in the sampling campaign description, but there were maybe a third or a quarter or a third less samples, so we didn't have quite a big sample size for our exposure models. So this could be a reason why. Tailpipe EC was only associated with EC 2.5 with FVC, and then the mass wasn't associated on its own, but coarse mass was associated with FVC. So not consistent results in terms of the mass, but fairly consistent results in terms of the associations with the non-tailpipe. This table is showing the unadjusted, but we of course need to adjust, or it's more appropriate to adjust for a PM. We saw exactly the same patterns, but it did attenuate the results slightly when we adjust for PM. So there's extensive literature, not extensive literature, but there's different methods in which you can take to tease out the relationship with the tailpipe, and the non-tailpipe from the whole mass, because of course the whole mass is going to contain the tailpipe. So anyway, so the approach we took was to adjust for the PM mass, but it attenuated all of the effects, but it didn't change the significance, statistical significance. So we have promising results here for this. So this is not published yet. This is work that we're just wrapping up from the HEI study. So, but all of the other work has been published. And so in summary, we conducted an extensive sampling campaign in Southern California. We had assembled one of the largest databases of size, element, and solubility specific PM. We conducted this extensive exposure assessment. So we developed these exposure models and estimated the components at study participants' home. We focused on non-tailpipe exposures, which are showing in our analyses that we see stronger associations with specific tracer elements than the mass alone and in lung function analyses. But we still are refining these models and looking at different effect modification and things like that. So there's still quite a bit of work to do on the epi side of this. So I'd like to just thank my study team. So this is still all my study team from USC. So Zhaozhe is my PhD student. She actually just defended in August. She's going to be going to HSPH to work with Petros for postdoc. And then Scott Fruin, another associate professor at USC, Rob McConnell, who's more on the epi side, and Masood, who used to be at U of T, actually working with Marianne, wanted to move to LA and contacted me. So he did a lot of the work on the traffic modeling and other aspects of this study. So, and then yes, this research was it was funded by the Health Effects Institute, and this is the disclaimer that we get to add to all of our work. Yeah, thank you very much. And any questions?
We do have some time for questions. Why don't we check online first?
Okay, sure.
See, for people online, you're free to use microphones or the chat.
Yes, so I don't know if you can, because I got a note here that from Natalie that we can hear me, but not Greg. So if there's any questions online, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll try to repeat the questions that come from the audience that so then those online can see it. But if you have any online, please go ahead or ask, put your mic on and ask, or type in the chat. That would be fine. Yeah.
So when you were going over, you quickly went over the sleep part.
Yeah.
And I was curious about noise, and then I saw noise in the title of your grant proposal.
Yes, so I cut out all of the noise stuff. So the main focus of this grant is on non-tailpipe and noise. So we're looking at so noise was associated with sleep. Yeah, it was associated with psychosocial stress. Also, we did a lot of measurements of noise. So we did, I didn't show any of that. I can give another talk on that, but that was a whole other aspect of the grant where we actually did this mobile monitoring of noise, developed similar exposure type models on all roads in the study areas, and associated that with all the kids too. Yeah. So it was traffic related noise. Yeah.
Did you see any noise with respiratory?
Okay, so that was actually the primary motivation of this study when we submitted the grant, was that we did see that it amplified. We didn't see a direct effect of noise on lung function, but what we saw was a confounding effect of lung function in that it intensified the association between, at the time we only had the non-tailpipe, it intensified the association between non-tailpipe, tailpipe and lung function significantly when we associated noise, or when we adjusted for noise. And so these study, I didn't show the results from that. I'm just going through all the tables now to see if it's done the same thing with the non-tailpipe. But yeah, that was a big part of it. So for online, we're just talking about noise. The question was about the role of traffic-related noise in this study as a part of a non-tailpipe. Non-tailpipe. It is non-tailpipe marker of exposure. Yeah.
Do you have a sense of what spatial scale you need for meteorology results?
Yes. What spatial scale of meteorology do we need? So we felt like the dark sky API what we originally did was we had looked for weather stations, but then there was only one weather station per community. So that wasn't really going to help us too much. And then there's, I mean, it could, but
that's my question.
Yeah.
Could you just use one weather?
It didn't. No, we found it not to be significant at all in our models, and it didn't provide any estimate, like help in terms of addressing the variability in the concentrations when we just used the weather station, because we did have one weather station per community. Okay. So that's why we went to getting this dark sky data, because it was hyper local.
So it really speaks to local wind patterns.
It really did, yes. So exactly, that's what we spent a lot of time on. The stability calculations that we made for that model, we only did per community, because we didn't have any means of calculating it otherwise. But yes, we did try that. But yes, the wind speed and wind direction were very important at a local scale. Yeah, it made a big difference. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, so the last the slide showing the lung function in the reserve, I just expect that there might be some of the influence of a side traction, so between the difference between the coarse and the fine mode. But I mean, your result looks like some sort of a mixed result.
It is, yeah. It's not totally consistent. That coarse is more. Yeah, I think it depends. Yeah. I think I didn't really see too much of a trend in that. I think we thought the coarse fraction might play a larger role in the non-tailpipe. And so, but it's not, we do see the effects of that. But for example, we see coarse zinc much stronger, but fine zinc not significant. But then with the coarse iron is a little bit less than fine iron. So both of those are significant. So it wasn't really, but our hypothesis was that the coarse fraction would be stronger, but it could also relate to how good our models were for those size fractions, because there's more variability in the coarse fraction that we saw, spatial variability. So, depending on how we captured it. The question was how the coarse and fine fractions matter in the health effects.
So, I mean, that means maybe we put some further studies. So this was based on some of the daily averaging of the metal concentration. For some relatively short 1 year of data, right?
So we developed, so what we did, we generated monthly exposure estimates, and then we took the average of the months 1 year prior to the lung function test. So it is an annual average, but it differs per child depending on when their lung function test was.
So is there any benefit to the using some of the higher time resolution, like hourly or some data, or the longer period?
Yeah, I mean, it was hard to do that. And the only thing I can speak to for that was the data that we did in some of our earlier studies that I did in my PhD, was when we looked at the acute effect. And so we looked at the mass, the daily effect of the mass on morbidity and mortality, and then basically took ratios of the concentrations of specific particles to the mass on a daily basis. And we did see associations. I think it was nickel, vanadium, a few others. We didn't focus on non-tailpipe in that study. But the benefit was just the outcomes that we could measure. It was just a totally different study design where we could look at that, which we can't use, unfortunately, we can't use that here. In the Southern California area, there's only one speciation trends monitor in Riverside. So that provides every 3 days monitoring. I don't know what the monitoring is like up here for speciation, but yeah, down in the States, the EPA only measures 1 in 3 or 1 in 6 days. So it's very hard to look at that. And then you may know more about the instrumentation for even finer resolved chemical species, but we don't really have access to those types of data. Yep.
When you do the FD, do you, little question, but do you place the child at their home or at their school? Or do you actually figure out where they spend their time? Well,
so the question is in terms of exposure at home versus school. So we have the exposures at homes and schools. This analysis was just at their residential exposure, but we can time weight. But kind of moot in a long-term study. You know, like we suggested we might look at that. We haven't done it yet, but you know, given that we have monthly exposures, their schools aren't too far from their homes, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference, but it is a sensitivity analysis that we would like to do because we can do that. But that's a good question. Yeah. Yep.
Did you look at ozone as a modifier? Was there a lot of variation between communities? Ozone can affect lung function too.
Yeah. Right. The question was whether we looked at ozone. We did not measure ozone in this time period. They measured ozone in the prior, and when they were looking more at NOx, the gases. And then for this particular sampling campaign, they didn't do any of the gases. They only focused on PM. And so I guess we could look, I mean, that's an interesting question in terms of the lung function. We could adjust by ozone because we did see that in some earlier work where we were looking more, again, morbidity and mortality, where we actually saw a stronger role of secondary aerosols than ozone. But I think it would be a good thing to adjust for in these models or to look at in a multi-pollutant context, but we'd have to rely on the, and it's fairly regional, right? So we'd have to rely on the EPA monitors for the data. But yeah, that's a good question. A good thought actually to look at that too. Yeah.
So we're a bit past the hour. I want
Okay.
to check to see if there's any more questions online.
Okay. Let me see if I can open it again. I lost the box. And now we got a blank screen. We're done. Okay, there we go.
All right. Well, then.
How was traffic model? Did you need to make a significant adjustments to the SUMO model because it was developed in Europe? I mean, the model was very transferable because you just used local inputs to the model, so we didn't have to make we didn't make any adjustments. I didn't do the model. Masood did the model modeling for the traffic. But yes, transit is very different in Europe, but I think he did make all the appropriate adjustments for that. And then, of course, the inputs were tailored for Southern California. And then we were able to, yes, we did distinguish between trucks and vehicles. And I think he removed anything that had to deal with diesel trucks or diesel, like the emphasis of diesel, which is in Europe. But that's a question I can't fully answer. Sorry. And for Marianne, braking acceleration, they also slow down traffic, reduce prevalence. Oh, that's a good question. Do you have any sense of the effect of urban intersections versus highway interchanges on the brakes and tire emissions? We did extract variables from the OpenStreetMap on all the on-ramps and off-ramps. They didn't show up in our models. So, you know, in trying to do all of these exposure models for being able to do the health effect studies, we didn't really specifically look at, you know, like exactly the concentrations itself. I think this would be a very good sub-study though, since we have all this information on the location, the distances to the on and off ramps to see if there's a difference. But we did put those in the models. They just didn't show up in those lists and those graphs that I showed of the important variables. But that's a good question to take a more specific look at that. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, with that, thank Meredith for a fascinating talk.
Great.
Look forward to working with you.
Yeah, me too. Great. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone online.